But we also have, during this time period, something we all know about, but not a lot about. We've heard about them, and they are called the Crusades. Hear a lot about them today in light of the rise of militant Islam. It's interesting. It's not until last, literally decades, that Muslim writers have started to use the Crusades as a religious thing. Up till then, it was just, from their perspective, it was just military campaigns, and this sort of way things were. They've learned to use it because of people in the West. They've learned to use it as a argument against Christianity and things like that. But at the time, they just viewed it as not so much religious as it was political. The Crusades last for about 200 years, about 1100 to 1300. The stated purposes was to win back land lost to the Muslims, especially in Palestine, but also in Spain and France. There were Crusades in Spain and France as well, because, as you recall, the Muslim expansion went across into what would be Spain, Portugal, and up into France. The expansion was ended 732, Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, the hammer, and all those guys up there and their whole dynasty and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, and so there is a pushing back of the Muslims out of mainland Europe there in Spain, Portugal, those areas. What caused the Crusades? Well, the Seljuk Turks invaded Palestine, attacked Christians who were on pilgrimages to Jerusalem and other of the holy places. And so in 1074, Gregory called for a crusade. Emperor Alexius from the east appealed to Pope Urban for help in 1095. So this is only, 50 years, around that 40 years after the Great Split. It must have been a little bit embarrassing for Emperor Alexius to appeal to Pope Urban for help, but they did. There was at this time a European famine, which made things difficult. Most of the Crusaders, therefore, that went on crusade, at least initially, were from the upper classes. There was also a real strong desire for trade in Europe at this time, especially material coming from the east, such as silk, pepper, cinnamon, things we take for granted, had to come from the east. And the Muslims were threatening the trade routes that went through this particular area. So never forget economics. It's always lurking in there someplace. And things were boring in Europe during the Middle Ages. So you got to admit, for a lot of these folks, it was the love of adventure. The Pope promised, and it is true, you've heard this story, that if one wore the cross and were to die during the Crusades, that they would skip purgatory. In other words, they would receive a plenary indulgence and go straight into the presence of God as long as they were wearing the cross, and hence all the pictures of the paintings of the Crusaders. The cross is very prominently there, and it's not overly shocking that most Muslims today believe the Christians actually worship the cross in light of the history that has existed down through the years. The First Crusade began under Pope Urban in 1099. Now realize you can't. It's not like even when everybody knew we were going to be invading Iraq, it still took time. Even with modern transportation and all the rest of that stuff, it still took time to stage the army and the materials and everything else, put it all together. Can you imagine when everybody's on horseback? And it literally takes months just to travel from one nation across a couple other nations to another nation, whatever else it might be. And so things just obviously can't move as quickly. in the ancient world as they can today. The people were spurred on by the preaching of such notables as Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless. How would you like to have the name Walter the Penniless? I guess that was supposed to be a good thing. The journey was very long, fighting the Turks all the way. I mean, it's long ways from France and northern Italy and Central Europe across all the way, all the way down into Muslim lands there. They arrived at Constantinople and finally did arrive in Jerusalem and established the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, which was sort of discussed. And what was that name of that movie? Kingdom of Heaven, is that what it's called? Yeah, Kingdom of Heaven. I'm not sure how many years ago that came out, but it was sort of what was being discussed there. And that Latin kingdom of Jerusalem lasted until 1187, so quite some time. It was a medieval feudal kingdom, but the First Crusade basically was successful. But it left the people there in somewhat of a precarious situation. And so the Second Crusade was organized but failed miserably. Bernard of Clairvaux was involved in getting it organized, but it became involved in many petty wars and finally an ambush in the gardens of Damascus in 1147, and it was a total failure. But then you have probably the most famous one. It's called the King's Crusade. Began in 1189 and ended in 1192. And this was the one led by Philip Augustus of France, Richard the Lionheart of England, and Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. So that's why it's called the King's Crusade. This was all the lovely people were involved. And the crusade was plagued by problems. Eventually, Philip took his army home. Said, enough of this. This isn't nearly as fun as I expected it to be. We're going home. Not enough pastries here. He was from France, remember. Now, it's interesting, Frederick Barbarossa was in, his battle armor and fell off of his horse in a river and drowned. I don't want to fall into the water wearing armor. I don't think it floats well, and it'd be horrible to be trapped inside that stuff. And just knowing, I ain't getting out of here. This is I've only got a few seconds left, and here we go. But they kept going under Richard, the Lionheart, and they got within sight of Jerusalem. They could see it, but only got concessions from the Muslim leader to allow pilgrimage and pilgrims to enter in and so on and so forth, but did not actually make it all the way to Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade used the idea of, now what's the problem here? It's a long ways to walk. It's a long ways to ride a horse. It's a long ways to carry food. It's just too long. So the Fourth Crusade used the idea of sailing to Egypt rather than fighting through all the land routes. And besides that, the Muslims are figuring out there's only a certain number of ways to get here. So let's fortify these areas. Good strategy, poor economics. They got to Venice, but not to Egypt. The city-state of Zara was causing Venice some problems. And so the Venetians promised that if the Crusaders would take Zara, then they would take them to Egypt. The Crusaders said, okay, and that's what they did. They took out the poor folks at Zara. And here's one of the great, massive blunders of history. Since they were in the neighborhood, they sacked Constantinople while they were at it too. Now, when I say massive blunders, Constantinople had stood as the gateway to Europe, holding back Muslim forces since the 8th century. And so if the Crusaders come along, and because it's animosity between the Venetians and these city-states like Venice were in constant competition for money. It was trade routes. It was all economics. And they owned the sea lanes. They had the navies. Since they used the opportunity to damage Constantinople to enrich themselves, then it's only going to be a couple centuries till the Muslim armies are at their gates because of the foolishness of their ancestors. But that's what happened. And they weakened Constantinople, and as you know, Constantinople falls in the middle of the 15th century and is very important, as we will see, to the Reformation and what took place during that time period. Then we had the Children's Crusade. This was... It was made up of boys 18 and younger, led by Stephen and Nicholas. They felt that all the other crusades had failed due to spiritual impurity, which probably wasn't an overly bad theory when you really think about it. And so they thought, let's take innocent young people, and because we're spiritually pure, then God will bless us, and we will just be able to walk right into Jerusalem and free it from the infidels. They marched to Genoa, where Stephen and Nicholas had promised that the Mediterranean would part for them. Now, that does solve all of your transportation issues when you think about it. Don't have to worry about ships going to Egypt. Don't have to worry about land routes. If the Mediterranean just splits for you, you just walk on through, and that sort of works. They get to Genoa, and you walk up to the seashore, and the Mediterranean didn't split for them. So they were offered, the Genoese offered them 3 ships for transport, which they got on. And 2 of them disappeared. The third went to Egypt and sold everybody on it into slavery. So the Children's Crusade didn't go very well. The results of the Crusades. The object was not achieved, obviously. By 1291, the Crusader states had all collapsed. Feudalism in Europe was weakened by the movement of knights and lords who had to sell off land to be able to support themselves on their trip. This did help with the rise of the middle class. When feudalism breaks down, you've got these people that have some money, but not a lot, but they're no longer just scraping by, digging in the dirt. This new class established free cities that were not under the authority of a lord specifically. Hence, you start getting some semblances of democratic government or representative government and city councils that we'll end up seeing a lot of in the Reformation, especially in Zurich. Good example of something along those lines. Trade was enhanced, especially for Italy. And there was also a decrease in morality at this time as well. War tends to do that, and it didn't really matter if you had a cross on your shield or not. The Crusaders were not, as a group, the most holy of individuals one might recognize.